We talk endlessly about boomers and millennials. We dissect Gen Z like there's some kind of fascinating new species. But there's an entire generation that just exists quietly in the middle, barely mentioned, almost invisible. Generation X. Born roughly between 1965 and 1980, they're your older coworkers who never complain. They're the exact people who built the internet but refuse to post about their breakfast. And here's the cold truth. Their psychology is the most misunderstood of any living generation today. Most people assume generational differences are just about age or shifting technology, but the reality is much darker and far more calculated. To understand why this generation survives every single economic collapse, you have to look at how their brains were built. Picture this. It's 1978. You're 8 years old. You come home to an empty house because both of your parents are working. There are no smartphones, there are no Ring cameras, there's absolutely no way for anyone to check if you're okay. You let yourself in, make a snack, do your homework completely alone, and you wait. This wasn't an isolated incident. A study published in the American Journal of Orthopsychiatry found a truly staggering statistic. By 1984, approximately 7 million children between the ages of 5 and 13 were regularly unsupervised after school. That's an entire generation learning one very specific, ruthless lesson. You can't always count on someone being there. This empty house did more than just make them fiercely self-reliant. It drilled in the absolute reality that actions have real, immediate consequences. When their parents finally showed up, the rules hit hard and fast. Nobody cared about how you felt. Nobody wanted to sit down and talk about your deep emotions. Step out of line and you paid for it right then and there. Psychologists formally call this a high contingency environment. This means actions and outcomes are directly linked without any protective buffer time. Your brain learns to predict consequences in real time, which is exactly why Gen X tends to think 3 steps ahead in ways that completely baffle younger generations. They were the first generation of latchkey kids on a massive scale. They were trained by absence. They were disciplined by reality. So how does this childhood shape a financial and psychological survivor? The answer lies in what they watched the adults do. Gen X grew up watching their parents talk a big game about stability and the American dream. Then they watched those same adults turn around and rack up record divorce rates through the 70s and 80s. Furthermore, they saw people give their absolute all to massive corporations only to get handed pink slips when the next round of corporate restructuring hit. The system aggressively told them to work hard, follow the rules, and life would work out perfectly. But then the rules just changed right in front of their eyes. The system lied. Psychologists might label their reaction to this trauma as defensive pessimism, but Gen X just calls it being realistic. They built up an incredibly heavy emotional armor. They cross their fingers for good things, but deep down, they fully expect the rug to get pulled out. Because honestly, that's exactly what kept happening to everyone around them. This isn't cynicism. This is a highly evolved survival mechanism. Consider how this directly impacts their modern behavior. This deeply ingrained skepticism is a major reason you barely hear them on social media. They grew up in a time when privacy was just normal. When you messed up as a kid, maybe a handful of people in a basement or a parking lot knew about it, and that was that. The idea of blasting your personal life out for thousands of strangers to see doesn't feel exciting to them. It feels inherently risky. It's not about failing to understand modern technology. It's about a core psychological lesson learned very early on. The less people know about you, the safer you are. They literally turned irony into an impenetrable shield. Crack a joke, keep things at arm's length, laugh it off before it actually stings. You can see exactly where this defensive psychology comes from. They grew up deep in the shadow of the Cold War. Teachers talked about nuclear war like it was just another rainy day. Duck and cover drills in school were completely normalized, as if a thin wooden desk would miraculously save anyone from total annihilation. When adults act like everything is about to go up in smoke, but simultaneously insist you shouldn't worry, a bizarre psychological split happens. You get used to holding 2 violently clashing ideas at once, and you learn to keep a little distance, just in case. But here is what is truly fascinating about their survival mechanism. Despite all this ingrained skepticism, Gen X developed a distinctive approach to work that stands out even today. They don't talk about it. They don't post inspirational quotes about it. They just do it. This relentless work ethic was forged early through jobs that seem almost archaic now. We're talking about paper routes at 5 in the morning. We're talking about bagging groceries and working fast food registers. Crucially, these were jobs where you had to calculate change in your head when the machine completely broke. These weren't padded resume builders. They were raw, unfiltered introductions to the adult world. A 12-year-old could literally be responsible for delivering the daily news to an entire neighborhood. This early exposure built a mechanical intuition and a profound sense of accountability. So, why do they seem so detached from modern corporate culture? The answer is rooted in pure behavioral economics and brutal observation. They watched their parents' generation get absolutely destroyed by corporate restructuring. Therefore, they never believed in the illusion of company loyalty, but they're fiercely loyal to their own competence. They understand they can't control whether they'll get laid off by a faceless board of directors, but they absolutely can control whether they're the most valuable person in the room when those layoffs happen. Let's talk about their highly complicated relationship with authority. A fascinating observation, often shared in modern sociological spaces, highlights how Gen X completely redefined respect in the workplace. But the real psychology behind this shift is brutally simple. They respect competence, not titles. If you have earned your position through actual demonstrable skill, they will follow you anywhere. If you're just someone with a fancy job title who doesn't actually know what they're doing, they have zero patience. Gen X relentlessly questions authority because they watched incompetent authority figures make terrible decisions their entire childhood. From Watergate to the Iran-Contra affair, straight through to the tragically fumbled AIDS crisis, they witnessed systemic failure on a massive scale. This profound distrust was then cemented by severe economic headwinds. These were massive financial disasters that their parents' generation hadn't fully experienced. The youngest Gen Xers graduated college and stepped directly into the dot-com bubble burst. Meanwhile, the oldest ones were just hitting their peak earnings stride when the 2008 financial crisis completely decimated the global economy. They have been economically traumatized repeatedly. Of course, some might argue that every single generation faces economic hardships and recessions, but the precise timing and the devastating severity of these specific crashes uniquely rewired their financial DNA, which is exactly why they're significantly more likely to aggressively build multiple income streams today. This isn't because they're inherently entrepreneurial or passionate about modern hustle culture. It is a pure, unadulterated manifestation of loss aversion. This is behavioral finance at its most primal level. The psychological pain of losing everything in 2008 vastly outweighed the potential joy of any corporate promotion. They don't build side businesses to buy luxury cars or show off their wealth. They build them as a financial bunker because they've learned the absolute hardest lesson of modern capitalism. Absolutely nothing lasts. Consider how this extreme survival mechanism bleeds directly into their personal lives. Gen X tends to intensely struggle with what clinical researchers have identified as patterns of hyper self-reliance. These are ingrained behavioral patterns that frequently border on severe, unmanaged anxiety. They are undeniably incredibly capable at handling chaotic, high-stakes crisis situations. But that exact capability often comes from a complete and total unwillingness to depend on anyone else. Rigorous research published in the Journal of Adult Development shows a very specific, undeniable trend. Gen Xers report significantly lower levels of seeking social support during highly stressful economic or personal periods. This is definitely not because they are friendless or completely lack a community network. It is because, to their specific neurological wiring, asking for help physically feels like admitting absolute defeat. A fascinating theory recently shared in the pop psychology space suggests this is simply a toxic form of stubborn independence. But the real behavioral science behind this phenomenon tells a much darker story. They learned at age 8 that if the world fell apart, no responsible adult was coming to save them, so they simply stopped expecting a rescue. Furthermore, this brutal self-reliance extended directly to how their brains actually process information. Before the internet existed, knowledge had a completely different kind of gravitational weight. Information fundamentally had a physical cost. It required raw effort, extreme patience, and actual time. Gen X literally spent hours in physical libraries, hunting through massive wooden card catalog drawers for a single elusive book. They hoped that one book might contain the specific answer they desperately needed. Because of that intense friction, they valued what they learned entirely differently. Cognitive psychologists formally describe this exact phenomenon as deeper encoding. This means information that requires significant physical or mental effort to obtain becomes more permanently integrated into long-term memory. They didn't just passively consume a rapid feed of algorithms. They actively, physically hunted for the truth. This specific cognitive wiring built what we call mechanical intuition. They learned to fix things with their own hands because that is exactly what you did when your bike chain violently slipped or when the living room TV suddenly flickered to static. You didn't call a specialized technician or immediately buy a replacement online. You flipped the heavy bike upside down on the concrete. You got black grease all over your hands, and you aggressively figured it out until it worked again. This created a profound, unshakable belief that with enough patience and a simple screwdriver, you could eventually master the physical world. They trust their hands far more than they trust any massive institution. Which ultimately brings us to the most tragic psychological paradox of Generation X. Today, they are intensely watching their own children grow up in a completely alien reality. They are raising Gen Z and Gen Alpha in a modern world entirely saturated with helicopter parents. They see constant, suffocating adult supervision and relentless social media documenting every single mistake. They consciously decided to give their kids the exact attention and emotional safety they never personally had. But a deep, agonizing psychological anxiety constantly haunts them. They worry intensely that they have accidentally made their children too soft, too dependent, and dangerously visible. We must remember their absolute core survival rule. In the Gen X worldview, being visible automatically means being vulnerable. By actively removing all the harsh friction from their children's lives, they have feared they have accidentally removed their ability to survive the next inevitable economic crash. While the sociological data on modern parenting outcomes is still mixed, the most likely scenario is a profound generational clash of resilience. The parents who survived the absolute cold are now terrified their own children will freeze in a mild breeze.
The absolute truth is Generation X might be the very last demographic that truly understands what it means to be completely alone with your own thoughts. They are the final generation to experience profound, uninterrupted boredom, to sit in absolute silence and actually solve complex problems without instantly Googling the answer. They are fundamentally not better than any other generation, but they are undeniably different. Their entire collective psychology was shaped by a highly unique, fleeting moment in human history. They matured exactly when the heavy, industrial old world was violently dying, and the hyper-connected digital world hadn't quite been born yet. They are the ultimate bridge generation, and sociologically speaking, bridges rarely get any actual respect or attention. People simply drive over them at high speeds to get to the next shiny destination. But the heavy, unglamorous bridge is exactly what holds the entire societal structure together. They're just there, silently doing the heavy lifting, holding the collapsing economic pieces together, and expecting absolutely nothing in return. And maybe that's the most authentic, defining characteristic of the Gen X mind. They genuinely don't care if anyone notices them or validates their historical trauma. So what is the critical lesson you must extract from their invisible survival? Consider the current economic climate we're standing in today. Massive corporations are brutally slashing thousands of jobs, while inflation silently erodes your hard-earned savings. The modern financial system is currently more fragile and predatory than it has ever been. If you constantly rely on external validation, blind corporate loyalty, or immediate social support to survive the next inevitable recession, you will be crushed. You must actively adopt the Gen X armor. Stop seeking a comfortable rescue boat from a government or an employer that fundamentally views you as a disposable line item on a spreadsheet. You must build your absolute competence. Create your multiple streams of income before the economic roof inevitably collapses again. You need to aggressively cultivate the brutal self-reliance of an 8-year-old coming home to a dark, completely empty house. When the market violently turns against you, your unshakable skills and your mechanical intuition are the only real assets you truly own. The market doesn't reward hesitation, endless complaints, or emotional fragility. It rigorously rewards pure, independent execution. Stay smart and keep growing. This is MOA.